Well, thank you again, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I'm going to take a sip of water. We'll get going. The title of today's talk is Inlets Becoming Outlets, and the inspiration for that is Ralph Waldo Emerson. In one of his essays, I can't remember which one it is, he talks about the fact that we as human beings, we as individualized expressions of God, that we are already inlets of the divine. Everything that the divine is right here, present where we are. We don't have to do anything to bring it to us. This is very important because traditional belief, probably the way we were raised, somehow we had to pray hard enough to get whatever good it was that we desired to come from wherever it was to us. You know, we were trying to get God out there to send something to us down here. But Emerson tells us we are already the inlets. It's already here. The good is already here, right? Omnipresence. God is everywhere present. As we tell the kids in Sunday school, there's no spot where God is not. Everywhere present. And what is it that is everywhere present? Is it a little bit present here and a little bit present there? And the answer is no. All of it is everywhere present. All of the wisdom is everywhere present. All of the power is everywhere present. So right where you and I are, and we have to qualify that because we think we are here in our physical bodies, in whatever building we're in whatever town we're in. That's what we think. But in truth, because we are part of that one which is everywhere present, we too are everywhere present. We just don't know it. We just haven't realized it. But right where we are, everything that God is. Now, we don't always realize that. We don't always believe that. We don't always act as if that is so. But just because we don't believe it or act as if it is so doesn't change the fact that it is. It is. So what we want to discuss today is what Emerson was kind of inspiring us to do, is to recognize, first of all, that we already are inlets. We already are some part of that magnificent divine that we can call God, we can call love, we can call nature, we can call spirit, we can call first cause. It doesn't matter to it what we call it. But we are some part of that. We are a spark of the divine. We are an individualized expression of that one God. And we may become outlets. We may become, notice he used the word may, which implies may or may not. We may become outlets. And you would have to ask, well, what does that mean? How can we become this outlet? What must we do in order to become this outlet of the divine? And aren't we in fact already outlets of the divine? Isn't the divine in fact expressing itself through us to the current level of our understanding, to the current level of our belief? And the answer to that, of course, is yes, it is. It is. But most of the time, it is not through a conscious act of will or volition on our part. Most of the time, it is acting through the subliminal, is the best word we could think of. Subliminal beliefs that we hold that are below the threshold of our conscious awareness. But nevertheless, we hold them. So the divine, through what we call the law of mind, is always acting for us according to our belief. But we are not always consciously aware of what we believe. And we are not always consciously choosing what we wish to believe. So we may become the outlets. We may become the conscious co-creators. We may become the outlets of the divine if we will take control of our thinking. If we will take the time to realize what we believe and to update our beliefs and to choose our beliefs. That's what we want to talk about today. Today we are looking at the second chapter of the Introduction of the Science of Mind textbook written by Ernest Holmes. Now, Ernest Holmes grew up in a very, very backcountry area of Maine as a little boy. He was born, I think, in 1888. And he was raised in a very backcountry part of Maine. In fact, today I know people who go to that area and they say it's still very, very rural. I mean, logging is still one of the biggest industries up there. There's still not a whole lot of modern business in the area. And Ernest says he was very lucky to be raised in a home where he was allowed to think. He was allowed to challenge his thoughts. His mother called him the little question mark. And this comes from his brother Fenwick's biography of Ernest. His mother called him the little question mark because he always had questions. He always wanted to know. And Fenwick tells us that there were only a couple of books in the family when they were growing up. There was a Bible, there was an illustrated children's Bible, and there was a book called Natural Law in the Spiritual World by Henry Drummond, D-R-U-M-M-O-N-D, Drummond. And for those of you who have Kindles or a Kindle app on your device, you can go to Amazon. Amazon has that book, and it's free. And you can download it and you can read it. And when you read it, keep in mind that this is one of the books that shaped the thinking of Ernest Holmes as he was growing up. And Fenwick relates a story one time where what was going on is, this is before radio and before TV, and what people did in those days for entertainment and perhaps for adult education is there were lecture circuits. And these lecturers would go from town to town, and they would go to the town hall and they would deliver a lecture on some topic. For example, Drummond coming and speaking on natural law in the spiritual universe. And they would have a book table in the back, and they would sell their books and their pamphlets and other things to help people to grasp what it is that they were teaching, and also to help provide some income for them. And I'm fairly certain that this is where Ernest's mother got a copy of Drummond's book. So his mother was a seeker. His mother was friends with the clergy, and they would have the clergy over for dinner, and there would be deep theological discussions that Ernest got to sit around and listen to as a child. And again, to be raised in an environment where he was taught it's okay to question, it's okay to ask. And Fenwick tells a story one time of they got a new preacher in town, and on Sunday the father hitched the horse to the buggy and put the boys in the buggy and took them off to church. And they listened to the sermon, and then on the way back, as they were coming down the road, the father pulled the buggy over to the side. He pulled up the horse, he stopped, and he turned to the boys and he said, "Now listen, boys," he says, "I don't want to say anything bad about that new preacher." He says, "But when that preacher told you that God sees you as a worm in the dust crawling on your belly," he says, "that preacher was just wrong." And that's where the father left it, just wrong. But this raised within Ernest, I believe, this raised within him the knowledge that it's okay to question. It's okay to ask. You don't have to agree with everything everyone tells you, even your clergy. It's okay to be a little question mark. It's okay to be curious. And as Ernest went through life, from what we know of his biography, he read a great deal. He read he read the Eastern Scriptures. He recommended a book called The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo, which is a kind of a Hindu treatise on life. And he studied many different people. He said that he moved to Boston when he was 19 to go to work for one of his brothers, maybe a little bit earlier than 19. And he read Emerson for the first time, and he said it was like drinking like drinking cool water, on a hot day. It was so refreshing. Here was another soul who was okay to dive deeply into belief and into consciousness. You might remember that Emerson was a Congregationalist minister. Now they were the original Puritans, the Pilgrims who came to Massachusetts, evolved into the Congregationalists. And Emerson was asked to give a speech to the graduating class at the Harvard Divinity School at the time, which consisted of all of about 8 students. But nevertheless, Emerson went and he gave them a speech, and his speech was so shocking that they didn't invite him back for about 30 years. And basically he told them, he said, if you're going into the ministry and your purpose is to build buildings with stained glass windows where people can come and adhere to your denomination, you're doing it for the wrong reason. You're doing it for the wrong reason. That religion as we know it, self-serving religion in terms of building denominations and growing members and all those things, that was the wrong reason. That they needed to be doing it to help people love God more deeply. That's what it's all about. And of course that didn't sit well with the establishment, who built a college, a university, and trained divinity students and sent them off to further enhance the denomination. So Holmes read Emerson and he said it was like drinking cool water on a hot day. It was so refreshing. And somewhere along the way he picked up the works of Thomas Troward. And Troward gave Dr. Holmes a great piece of his own worldview, his own personal philosophy, a piece that was kind of missing before. And Troward explained the law of mind as an impersonal power. We have this concept of a personal God, a God who, in traditional religions, a God who was more like a human being than a God. And then Troward comes along and says, no, there's this impersonal power in the universe. There's this law of mind. It is done unto us according to our belief. And because it is done unto us according to our belief, if we believe in evil, we experience evil. If we believe in lack, we experience lack. If we believe in abundance, we experience abundance. Now what this did for Ernest was it kind of helped him to understand or to solve what theologians have wrestled with for years, which is called the problem of evil. And basically it comes down to this: if God is so good and God is everywhere present, then why do we see bad things happening? Right? The book of Job is all about this. As I mentioned last week, Rabbi Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. So the theologians have come up with many explanations along the way as to why, if God is so good and God is everywhere present, that we have these things that none of us can deny are terrible things happening. So theologians have come up with the idea, well, there's 2 powers in the universe. There's a power for good and there's a power for evil. And this power for evil is allowed or permitted by the power of good to go out and torment and to test and to give people disease and catastrophes of every kind and all these things. But ultimately, in the long run, eventually the power of good is going to win out. And that's kind of the explanation that was going around in this country in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So what Thomas Troward's writings did for Ernest Holmes was helped him see, no, there's not a power for evil. And by the way, for those who are religious historians, which I don't know why anybody would want to be one of those, but if you are, this whole idea of the duality, the power of good and the power of evil, kind of crept into our culture. It came from Babylon. It came when the Jewish people were carried off into the Babylonian activity. In Babylon, there was a religion, Zoroastrianism, and it still exists today. In fact, I have friends I worked with up in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina who were practicing Zoroasters. Zoroastrianism had a belief in the Prince of Light and the Prince of Darkness, the power of good and the power of evil, and the struggle of good and evil. And that was their way of understanding, what we call the power of evil. But before that, this idea of the power of evil as a separate entity, allowed to torment and all those things, it just didn't exist. So Ernest started to really get it then. He really started to understand it. You have to kind of see the evolution of his thought. Drummond talking about spiritual, natural law in a spiritual world. Emerson, talking about how important what we think and we believe is. And Troward talking about this power we call the law of mind that responds unto us according to our belief. So all of these things kind of came together for Ernest as he formulated his ideas, and he started to go out and teach. And when he wrote this textbook, the one that we're using, the 4 chapters that we study in January are really Dr. Holmes restating or reframing in his own way the ideas that Thomas Troward expressed in a little book called The Creative Process in the Individual. Excuse me. Now, The Creative Process in the Individual was written a long time ago, 1890s, early 1900s, 1898, I think, to the early 1900s. So it's in the public domain, and you can, in fact, go out on the internet and search for that, and you will find that book. And it might be helpful to read that along while we're studying these 4 chapters. But pretty much to sum up what Troward said and what Ernest Holmes is telling us in the Introduction to the Science of Mind textbook. By the way, Science of Mind is the teaching. Science of Mind is the teaching that Ernest Holmes developed, the curriculum, if you want to think of it that way. And he was not the first one to use that term. But Science of Mind is the teaching, and religious science was the organization that was put into place to carry on the teaching. And now it's called Centers for Spiritual Living. So Thomas Troward, to really simplify what Troward said, is Troward said that, there's the macrocosm, there's the big picture, and there's the microcosm, there's the little picture. And the little picture is made out of the big picture. That the little picture that we see around us is as much of the big picture as we can take in. And since in the big picture, the way that the divine creates, or God creates, or Spirit creates, however you want to talk about it, the creative process at the big picture level is a mental process. It is a process of thought. Right? So whatever our concept of God or the divine is, it doesn't have a body. It's not humanoid, but it's conscious. It's conscious awareness. And what is the activity of consciousness but thought? So the divine creates through a movement of thought, and some part of the divine that acts as a law of mind, takes this idea, this movement in thought that the divine had, and it executes it perfectly. It brings it into existence perfectly. As I said last week, in Genesis, God said, "Let there be," and then there was. And the reason it was this law of mind, this power acted upon the direction that was given to it by the divine mind. And what Troward is saying is that's the way it works at the big picture, the macrocosm level, and that's the way it works at the little picture, you and I, the microcosm level. Because we are little sparks of that divine. We are individualized expressions of that divine. So the creative process of the universe exists right here where we are and functions at the level of our consciousness, our thought, our beliefs. And this is what Dr. Holmes is telling us in the second chapter of the textbook. The second chapter, this is actually the second chapter of the introduction to the textbook. And the second chapter has to be one of the shortest chapters in the entire book, and yet I would be willing to say that it is the most important. If we really get what he's trying to tell us, it is most important. Because what he is doing in this chapter is he is very, very subtly laying down some questions for us to consider. The questions aren't stated plainly. They are inferred from his writing. But we have to ask ourselves, what is belief? What is belief? And how do we come by our beliefs? And how do we change our beliefs? And the reason for that is he goes on in this chapter to explain that because the creative process works for us where we are, it works according to our belief. It works on what we believe to be true. And if that's so, then the obvious question is well, what do I believe? And how did I get those beliefs? And if those beliefs are not serving me well, how do I change those beliefs? That is the very stuff that life is made of. See? So the first thing he goes on to tell us is we have to recognize a couple of things. And the first is that the power is already here. And it's ours to discover, and it's ours to use, but we can only use as much of it as can come through our consciousness. Now let me give you kind of an example at the physical level, at the level of Newtonian, if you will, Newtonian physics, kind of the things that you and I learned in school, protons, neutrons, and electrons. And now, of course, we know that there's something even further beyond that. But just working at that level that we learned as children in school, I want you to take something as simple as water in a river flowing downstream. None of us will deny that water in a river flows downstream, right? You can go out to any river near where you live, and you can sit there and you can watch the water flowing down the hill, flowing down the stream, flowing to the ocean. Now we know that that's a fact. We accept that that's a fact, right? If I asked you, do you believe that water flows downhill? You'd say, of course it does. I've seen it. It flows downhill. I know that water flows downhill. But if I asked you, why does water flow downhill? It wouldn't take very long before the conversation would get to, well, gee, I don't know. Right? One of the things that we were taught in trying to do process improvement in business was to ask why 5 times before we made a change. Because the first level of why is usually a very superficial one. There's been an error made. Why? Well, somebody screwed up. First level of why. Second level might be, well, why did they make that mistake? And usually the answer is that, well, they're just no good, so we fired them. They didn't follow rules or whatever. And that's usually where it ends. And if you watch the scandals, the political scandals in our country, which the news media loves to carry, usually that's as far as they get. This happened because somebody made a mistake, and we've held them accountable. We've gotten rid of them, and that's the end of it. And that's usually as far as it goes. So what I learned is when you stop to try to ask why 5 times, you find out how little your organization really knows about what it's doing. Now, for me, I was studying for the ministry at the same time, and you take that over to your personal life, and if you ask yourself why 5 times at anything that you believe, we will find out very quickly that most of what we believe it doesn't stand on very firm ground. So let's go back to the river. So the river's flowing downhill and it's going to the ocean. But why? Well, we all know the answer to that. We learned it as children. It's this thing called gravity. And gravity makes the water flow downhill. Gravity makes the water flow down the hill, and as long as there's a hill to go down, the water will flow down, and the water will eventually make its way to the ocean. And if it gets dammed up somewhere along the way, if the grade is higher, further downstream, well, it will just pond up and it will make a lake, But it's this thing called gravity. And go, oh, okay, gravity. Well, why? Why does gravity make water go downhill? So now here we get to, now we don't know. Now we don't know. You see, and when I'm talking we, I'm talking about our society, I'm talking about our scientists. We still have trouble kind of explaining gravity. We grew up with Newtonian mechanics, and people would speculate, well, there's protons and there's neutrons and electrons, and there must be this thing in there called a gravitron. And this gravitron somehow attracts itself to the gravitrons in other molecules, and that's their action is what we recognize as gravity. And then Einstein comes along and says, well, no, that's not it at all. It's because space-time itself is curved and everything is moving along the curve, and it just appears to be falling downhill, but it's not. And that's where I get left out of the whys. I personally can't go any further than that because I just go, I don't understand it. So water is flowing down the hill, and the average person doesn't know why. Maybe a quantum physicist somewhere can take it another level why, but I can't. But water is flowing down the hill. And I say, so what? So water is flowing down the hill. Well, what good is that? What can we do with that? Is there any practical application of that? And we find out that, well, yes, in fact, there is. Some cultures, what they realized was that if they dug an irrigation ditch from the river out into their fields, and if they sloped it downward, the water would go downhill through the irrigation ditch, and it would just naturally flow from the river into their fields, and it would water their crops. Other cultures come along and they developed a pipe, and they found out if you just stick the pipe into the river with the open end of the pipe pointing up into the stream, the water pressure would go in the pipe, and you could get running water into your home without having to have a well and carry buckets of water and those things. Other people came along and they said, well, we can put, if you've been out to the Northwest, we can put a fish wheel. They built a fish wheel that they put out into the river, and they used the flow of the current to turn this wheel, and this wheel had baskets on it, and as the baskets came up, they actually scooped the fish right out of the water, and as the basket got up to the top, like a Ferris wheel getting up to the top, the basket had a slant built in the bottom, and the fish would be dumped out of the basket into a chute where they would go down into a big bin to be collected. So somebody else came along and said, wow, we can use the power of the water flowing downhill to fish for us. And again, ask them, well, why is the water flowing downhill? We don't know, don't care. It does, and we can use it. And then centuries later, we saw people come along and build mills on the side of the rivers. They built big water wheels, and they built mills on the side of the river. Today we have huge dams, but essentially inside that dam somewhere is a water wheel, a turbine. Water flows through it, it turns a paddle, and we generate electricity. And then somebody else came along and said, we can take that water and we can break it down, because water is just hydrogen and oxygen. And we can separate the two out, and then we can take the hydrogen and we can we can crack the molecule. We can split the atom of hydrogen, and we can release a tremendous amount of power, as you see in hydrogen bombs. All of this power was in the river the whole time, right? Emmett Fox tells us when Moses was wandering around in the desert for 40 years, they didn't have a flashlight. But it wasn't because the laws of electricity didn't exist. It was because they did not have the consciousness of a flashlight. They did not know how to use the power that was already there. So even though the power is there, and even though in most cases we don't completely understand why it works, we haven't asked ourselves why enough times. It is there, and as our consciousness evolves, we are able to utilize more and more and more of it. So all advancements, all new things that come into our experience start first in consciousness. Somebody has an idea, somebody thinks a little bit. Dr. Holmes tells us that the greatest advancements come from people who have made their direct contact with the divine. Which, if you want to consider the purpose of religion and the purpose of life, it is, as Emerson was telling the students, it's not about building buildings with stained glass windows. It's about each and every one of us coming into a deeper realization of the presence of the divine that is here right now. So about the time that the Wright brothers were working on powered flight, other people were working on powered flight. There were people in Europe that were trying to figure it out, Lilienthal and others. And they were experimenting with gliders, which is what the Wright brothers did at the beginning as well. They just realized that while the folks in Europe were kind of bringing their glider to the top of a hill and running down the hill with it, the Wright brothers realized that they could come down somewhere like Kitty Hawk where the wind blew pretty steadily, and they could tether their airplane like a kite, and they could fly it like a kite. And that's why they came down there to do their experiments. At the time that they were working on this, there were people who said it can't be done. Well, my God, it just can't be done. We're never going to have a heavier than aircraft that can be flown. It just can't be done. And even after they did it, there were people who were saying it can't be done. There were people in Europe who were saying it wasn't. It wasn't done. They did not do that. It just wasn't done. So much so that the Wright brothers took their airplane apart, put it in crates, put it on a ship, went over to France, assembled it, and flew it around a racetrack in France in front of a public demonstration for the public to show them that, yes, in fact, it could be done. And within a very short time after them doing that, people in France were flying airplanes over to England. See, up until that point, the consciousness was saying it can't be done. There were some people who thought it could be done and they were working on it, but the general consciousness was it can't be done. When Roger Bannister was trying to break the 4-minute mile, there were people who were writing letters to the editor and op-ed pieces to the newspaper. Physiologically, it cannot be done. The human body is just not capable of doing what needs to be done. Well, when Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, within a month's time, other people broke the 4-minute mile. When England was building the first great ocean-going steamship to travel to India and to Africa from England, there were people who were doing detailed explanations of why it was physically impossible for a ship that size to be able to travel. It could never carry enough coal. It couldn't hold enough coal in order to stoke its boilers in order for it to make its voyage. The ship is sailing. I think it was the Britannia, I think it was the first one. The ship is sailing. The ship is making its rounds, and people are still saying it can't be done. So here's where I'm going with that. You see, if you and I look at what we believe and where did we get our beliefs from, I think we will find that most of the time our beliefs come from others, our parents, our teachers, our clergy, our friends, right? The people we hang out with. And they're all telling us the way it is and the way it can be. And it comes from our experience. Right? We try something, we have an experience, and we decide that that's the way it is. W. Clement Stone said that when he was traveling. W. Clement Stone, by the way, wrote a lot of self-help psychology books, Success in Sales and those kind of things. And he used to travel a lot for business. And one time he tried frog's legs. They were on the menu and he wanted something different. And they were awful. And he decided that frog's legs were awful and he never ate them again. And one night he met a bunch of his friends and they were having dinner and they told him, you have to try the frog legs here. They're really good. And he said, I don't like frog's legs. They said, oh, these are good. So he said, okay, I'll try them. But he said, as long as they're not the jumbo kind, because I don't like the jumbo kind. And they said, oh, no, you'll like these. So they brought them, and sure enough, they were jumbo frog's legs. And he tried them, and they were there. And he says they were delicious. And what he realized is that he had been living his life for years based on a belief that frog's legs were terrible. And what had happened was he had a bad batch the first time. So we have this power, we have this unlimited power, this power that will respond to us exactly according to our belief, the power that was strong enough to create the entire universe out of nothing, right? Last week we went from the visible back into the invisible. This week we're coming from the invisible back to the visible. This power that could create the entire universe to bring it forth from the invisible into the visible. That power is right where we are, and yet we don't realize it. It's like nobody looking at the river for all these years realized how much energy there was in the hydrogen atoms that are in that river. We thought we were doing good when we put a water wheel in it. So this tremendous power is right here where we are. It has created us out of itself. Right? It lives its life through us. It's excuse me. If you think of the lava coming out of the volcanoes, there's this molten core at the center of the earth, and wherever the volcanoes are, it's pushing through it, and life is pushing through each and every one of us. And it's responding to us according to our belief. Dr. Holmes tells us, can you imagine if we were floating in an ocean, and the ocean responded to our thoughts, and whatever we thought, an iceberg would form that would look exactly like whatever it was that we were thinking. And if we consider ourselves to be immersed in that creative medium, that same creative medium that the divine used to create the universe out of itself, we are immersed in it. Then we have to recognize that everything in our experience is a result of what we have believed. Number one. And number two, everything that we are observing around us is a result of collective consciousness, of race consciousness, the human race, of what it is believing. So if you and I, if we stop and ask ourselves, well, how do I come to believe what I believe? Most of the time we are observing things as they appear to be, and they only appear to be that way because they are the outpicturing of human consciousness. So we are looking at effect, and we are forming our belief based on effect. We are not looking at the big picture. We are looking at a small part of the little picture. So most of what we believe is not true. Most of what we believe because of what we have seen, and what we have seen is the result of what other people have believed. It calls to mind Wayne Dyer's book, When You Believe It, You'll See It. Most of us think when we see it, we'll believe it. So Joel Goldsmith tells us, we can read the the beautiful words in the scriptures, we can read those and we can recognize that somewhere along the line a human being has made their contact with the divine and brought forward this beautiful inspirational literature. But if that's as far as we go, we're still dealing in effect. That at some point what we have to do is go pass through that and make our own contact with the divine and come to know for ourselves what is true. So we as human beings can do something that as far as we know, no other species can do. And that is we can become aware of our thinking. We can become aware of what we are thinking and why we are thinking. And we can change our thoughts. And yet we spend very little time doing that. We are so engaged in everything else that we do to make a living, to watch the news, to take care of our families, that we spend very little time doing the very most important thing that we could ever do. All of the power of the universe is right where we are. It flows through us, but it flows through us according to our belief. And our belief can be any range from just, well, I only believe that a little bit to I really, really, really believe it. But most of the time, if we ask ourselves 5 levels of why do you believe that, we'll get to the second level and say, well, gee, I don't know. That's the way my parents believed, that's the way my friends believed, or that's the way it seems to be when I look out here. And we say, well, but you're looking out there, you're looking at somebody else's belief. All the people who believed they couldn't run 4 minute miles, they couldn't do it. And all the people who believed that you could never fly an airplane, they weren't trying to build one. So now we get down to the question of, what do I believe? Why do I believe it? And how do I go about changing my beliefs? And I think the answer to the first question is twofold. We can know what we believe, first of all, by looking at our lives and asking ourselves, what would one have to believe in order for that to be true? And we can observe ourselves. We can catch ourselves in the process of thinking. Of course, this is what meditation helps us to do. But I was looking online. They have the new fitness watches. I don't know if you've seen those. Or at Christmas, our granddaughter was over and her fiance has one. They do all kinds of neat things, tell you how far you've walked, all that stuff. But they have reminders on them. So you're supposed to drink a lot of water, 8 glasses of water a day or whatever it is, as the doctors are saying. So the watch has a reminder on it, and it will beep every so often to remind you that you need to take a drink of water. Or to remind you, if you've been sitting, if you have a desk job, it's time to get up and take a walk around the office and move your legs. And what you can do is you can take one of those watches or an application on your smartphone or something else, and what you can do is set yourself a little reminder. And when that reminder goes off, you can stop and ask yourself, what am I believing right now? What am I doing, and how does what I'm doing reflect upon my belief? Am I believing in the unlimited goodness of God? Am I believing in the limited goodness of the human race based on my experience? What is it that I believe? And if you work with that, you will start to see that many of the things that we talk about, many of the things that we do, that we are doing out of a belief in lack and limitation, in duality, in all of the things that the human race believes in. Excuse me. And at that moment, you have to ask yourself, are you ready to break out of the pack? Right? Do you want to continue to believe that it can't be done because nobody else has ever done it? Because they believed it couldn't be done? Or do you want to be like the Wright brothers or Roger Bannister? Do you want to believe that it can be done? If you ask yourself where you got these ideas from, in most cases you're going to be able to track down that you got them from someone else. You learn them in school, you learn them from your parents, you learn them from your teachers, you learn them from your clergy. Basically, it's shared ignorance. Basically, we have learned from people who didn't know. They were doing the best they could with what they had, but they didn't know. And they couldn't give us what they didn't know. So they would tell us that something couldn't be done. Perhaps they thought they were protecting us from trying and failing and being disappointed, without ever considering that they were consigning us to a life of mediocrity, which is also disappointing. So if we ask ourselves, how do I know what I know? Once we figure out what it is that I believe, how do I know that I know? I think that very quickly you will come to a realization that we don't know. We don't know it all. And that is for the purpose of making it much easier for us to let go. Right? It's much easier to let go of something that doesn't make any sense at all. You know? We do things the same way that our parents did, and they do them the same way their grandparents did, but their grandparents didn't have the same things that we have. My grandfather grew up on a farm in Brooklyn, New York in the early 1900s, and they didn't have refrigeration. So every morning when they got up, what they had for breakfast was leftovers from what they had last night. So they would try to eat up all the food before it went bad. It wouldn't go bad overnight, but if they left it for the rest of the day, it would go bad. He came to visit us one time, and Lori made a big bowl of chili. And what Lori would do is she would cook for the whole week and then put it in a refrigerator, and we would eat the meal several times during the week. Well, my grandfather was staying with us. This was in the 70s. He was staying with us, and he used to get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would go make himself breakfast. Well, he got up in the morning, and he ate 7 bowls of chili for breakfast, because that's the way he grew up. You ate whatever was left over. And I laughed. I said, "Pop, you know, we got things now called refrigerators that'll keep them for more than a day." And he said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." So the people who taught us were teaching us based on what they knew at the time. And it may have been appropriate at the time, and it's not appropriate now, or they may just not have known. They may just have been repeating something that was told to them, superstition that was handed on down from generation to generation. So you and I are the only thinkers in our world. We are responsible for changing our thoughts, for changing our beliefs. And the way that we do that is we educate ourselves. We hang out with different people. We listen to different talks. We read different books. But the most important thing that we are going to do, right, once we decide that we want to change our beliefs, if we have a belief in lack and limitation, we're going to change that into a belief of abundance, is our spiritual practice. That is what our spiritual practice is all about. We can meditate, which helps us to detach from our thoughts, so we're not so in love with what we thought that we're unwilling to let it go. And then we use the tools that Dr. Holmes gave us. We use spiritual mind treatment. We use a very specific process of setting into motion the law of mind, the power that responds to us according to our belief. And we set it in motion with the belief that it will change our beliefs. It will help us to change whatever needs to be changed within us, whatever needs to be changed within consciousness. Excuse me, for a deeper experience of the love of God. And as we do this, what happens is we find ourselves making a deeper and deeper connection with the love and the presence of God. And when we do that, then whatever needs to change, changes. So it's like turning on the light and the darkness disappears. When we do that, our inspiration is directly from the divine. It is, as Goldsmith says, we have gone back beyond the words of the people who wrote the scriptures, the people who made their contact with the divine and wrote the scriptures, and now we have gone back one further step and we are in contact with the divine ourselves. So this week, what I invite you to do is get a timer of some sort, whether it be on your phone or a watch or some other way. You know, get a piece of paper and just on the piece of paper just write down every 15 minutes, 8, 8:15, 8:30, things like that. And as much as you can during the day, look down, whatever time it is, what are you thinking? What do those thoughts reveal about what you believe? Why do you believe what you believe? Where did you get that belief? What is the truth that you want to believe? And what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it? We have been given the greatest gift in I would say the world, but in the universe, in existence, we have been given the greatest gift. We have been given the gift of being able to be aware of what we are thinking and to change what we are thinking. And to recognize that once we do that, all of the power of the universe flows through us. That life, like the lava ready to come out of the volcano, that life is ready to shoot through us, ready to express itself through us. But we have to provide the opening. We have to cooperate consciously. Excuse me. We have to become the outlets, knowing that we are already the inlet. So let's go forward this week without fear, without superstition, with a great practical application. When you catch yourself thinking something, ask yourself, what does that thought reveal about what I believe? Where did I get that belief? What do I want to believe? How am I going to change that belief? So what it does is the title of the second chapter. And what it does is it becomes through us according to our belief. And now we are committed to knowing what we believe and changing what we believe. And so it is.